Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the RugbyPass Offload, which is going to be purely surrounding the tackling height debate, which has, of course, sparked fury around the rugby world over the last couple of weeks. You may have noticed that we've replaced Max and Ryan with two men who are somewhat more engaged, hopefully educated and passionate on the topic, but sit somewhere on opposite sides of the argument. We think so. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. Ross Tucker, who's a science and research consultant for World Rugby and whose job it is to support all strategic decisions to improve player welfare, including injuries, concussions, and all-round health. And Jonathan Beardmore, who's an amateur rugby player and podcast host who has become a well-known voice in the press, speaking up for the amateur rugby community. Thanks for both joining us. I'd like to start by asking both of you to give your reasonings and reaction to the recent proposed law change by the RFU in a couple of minutes summary, and then we can open the floor to debate. So let's start with you, Ross.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me on. I hope it's a constructive discussion. My reaction, I'd say cautious optimism mixed with a little bit of concern and interest in exactly how it goes from this point. And the reason I introduce a bit of optimism is because we at World Rugby have known for 6 or 7 years now that the main risk factor driving head injuries and concussions in the sport is the height of contact in the tackles. And so lowering the legal height is something that then has begun to happen. And it's not the first place in the RFU. It happened in France in end of 2018 into 19. New Zealand announced a similar thing at the end of last year. So that's the reason for the optimism. The caution is the scale of the change all the way down to the waist. And then obviously it's been difficult to ignore the reaction from people. And the blowback and the resistance to that change is so large that it then makes me think, actually, I'm not sure even if they proceeded with it, whether this would work. Because if you don't get the buy-in from stakeholders, then any theoretical solution is doomed to failure. And then interest, because the subsequent discussion has been, to me, quite interesting. I'm not, in the name of disclosure, I'm not directly affected by any of this. I'm not playing the sport in the UK. My interest is as a researcher with World Rugby, and I'm interested to, see what people feel. I think it's been instructive and it's been good for learning about exactly how people feel, what they value, where they assess risk. But also interested to see how they proceed. Because, I mean, it's clear to me that the sport does need to do something about this concussion risk at a sports collective level. And it doesn't seem tenable that they can do it the way they've done it. So I would hope the debate at this point is how do we change it, not whether we should change it. And I'm interested to see how we proceed from this point.
That's great. Jonathan, how about you?
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, first of all, real privilege to be on with Ross. Huge fan of Ross's work. And I think it's important to acknowledge from this point the important work that Ross has done. I think the work around concussions, particularly for the pro game, has been instrumental, actually, in making sure that the game is sustainable going forward. My main contention here is that we are separating out the pro game and the amateur game. But I just think, although the science is clearly on solid footing, it's been mishandled. And from my point of view, I'm looking at the changes coming from the RFU into the community game. And yes, there is a solution to head injuries, but I'm left to think, like, to what end? Because we're looking to solve head injuries, because we're looking to solve concussions, and we're looking to solve concussions because of the horrendous stories coming out of the professional game with things like early onset dementia and all the other things which go with that. But ultimately, when you're playing down at level 6 and level 7, there are occasions where you encounter concussions, but it's not even on my top 5 biggest concerns. It's one of those situations, I think, which has been so overhyped in the media, and in some ways rightly so, because there are some lads playing professional rugby who are going to get severe later life consequences from all this. But we've been playing this game, broadly speaking, for 100 years at amateur level, and it just doesn't seem to be the biggest problem that we face. If I was to list the problems in amateur rugby, I'm not sure that this would even make top 5. And it's because of the good work of people like Ross Now, actually, when you're playing, your level 7 or your level 6 game now, we are more aware of concussions than ever. I mean, I think one of the most amazing things to come out of the RFU was just absolutely no acknowledgement that rugby is safer than it has ever been. Awareness of concussions is greater than it's ever been. When I first started playing this game, it would be very common for a guy to, get a head knock and just continue. That just does not happen now. In fact, frankly, I'm more worried about an overzealous physio taking me off on the weekend for a concussion that I haven't suffered, rather than actually suffering the concussion. That is the most likely reason that I will come off the field. So, to round this bit up, I just don't think the science has been applied properly, because science is one factor of a multifactorial equation, and it's kind of like saying the operation was a success, but we've killed the patient. Because I can tell you, after this comes in, certainly in the original way that the RFU described it, there's not going to be that many players left. I was out on Saturday with my team, and I'm not coming back to the game. I'm not playing this version of the laws. And I think the RFU have vastly underestimated how many players will leave, because I think it's going to be huge.
I think the main point that has been raised there, and I definitely agree with Jonathan on this one, is that we have to reduce concussion numbers, and I'll explain shortly why I think the community game also needs to focus on that. But if we begin by saying we're going to reduce concussion numbers, then we must realize that something has to change, and that change is the price you pay. Now, at some point, the price becomes too steep for the change. In other words, if we change concussion by a few percent, but if we lower concussion numbers by a few percent, but we change the game by 50% arbitrarily, then it's too expensive and we shouldn't have done it. So I'm very sensitive to the idea that if we don't get that calibration right, the cost-benefit ratio here, then we would have messed up. And in that regard, it is true, and I'm not saying this for sympathy from people who might be opposed to this, but rugby is, in a way, a victim of the spotlight on concussions, because he's right. Like, there's never been more awareness of concussion. There's never been more fear about the long-term effects. Those things are good, but if the reaction to them is too extreme, then they can become negative for the sport. And so there's trade-offs that have to be acknowledged here. I would just raise one point on this, is that in public health, it's always a dilemma, because the individuals in a public health system have a different perception of risk compared to the collective. But by that, I mean that on an individual basis, players might look at the risk of concussion in the community game, and they would quite correctly say the risk is actually quite low. It is way lower than in the professional game. And they may then say, knowing that the risk of a concussion to me, playing as I do on the weekend, is low, I'm prepared to accept that risk, and I'd like to just be left alone to take it. The problem is that the collective can't do that, because there are 100,000 people who all accept that risk. And even if the risk is low, when you scale it up by volume, it becomes a major problem. So if it's a 1 in 100 risk, fine. But if it's done to 100,000 people, that's a lot of concussions. And the evidence does show that even in the community game, and this is around the world, I've seen stats in New Zealand and Australia, is that concussion and other head injuries are the most likely reason for kids, for instance, to end up in the hospital emergency ward. And that's coming from the community game. So I'm not saying that to dismiss how individuals assess their risk, but I think one does have to be aware that those who are responsible from the top have to assess the collective, whereas those who are assessing it from the bottom can assess the individual. And there's a disconnect that creates. And if we're going to meet halfway and get the calibration right, we've got to find the point at which both parties are satisfied. And so I think what's happened here is that it's gone too far, because quite clearly the reaction shows you that they've changed it in a way that's been rejected by so many people. So it's too expensive a price. But if we can shift it back a little bit, and I don't know what happens next, but hopefully that's where we land, is a point where people say, okay, you've lowered the risk to me, didn't think I needed it, but I understand why you needed to do it. Now we can continue.
Yeah. Can I just say thank you for that point, Ross? I think it's an absolutely brilliant point. And I don't really know what to do with that data, because the last thing in the world that I want is for the game that I play on a weekend to be influenced by outside bodies, and, in particular, the public health lobby. Because if we were to listen to everything that they did or wanted us to do, we would live incredibly miserable lives. I do take the point that if you scale it up, you're going to have more, more absolute numbers of concussions. But that's the same with absolutely everything. Everyone decides to drive. Everyone decides to go mountain climbing. Everyone decides to, go scuba diving. Rugby is a very particular sport, and it attracts very particular individuals. And the thing I always think of is, why do we have so many guys who finish rugby and then become relatively overweight? And the reason is because they were playing rugby before, and that was the thing which motivated them to get fit, motivated them to do something on a weekend which was physical. And as soon as they stop that, that motivation is gone. So the public health debate, again, is sort of one factor of many. So by reducing concussions, by changing the game fundamentally, you're probably getting rid of the motivation for a lot of people to play, be active, and all the other things which the public health lobby talk about. There are no real solutions to this. There's only trade-offs. And again, I don't think that running rugby in accordance to the principle of risk reduction is a good way to run a contact sport, because there's no real limiting principle.
Is there effectively a point where you're saying that the rules should be changed between pro and amateur? Because, unless you think that, there's all these issues around concussion, MND, dementia, that nothing needs to be done.
Yeah, so a couple of things I just wanted to come back to. One is, there is definitely a move towards treating the community game separately from the elite game within World Rugby when we consider player welfare issues. There's no doubt that that's going to happen more and more. Whether the direction of those changes and their scale is acceptable is, I guess, the issue. It seems you could, in fairness, make a case to say that the community game should be more conservative than the professional game. And in general, in the public health space, the more people have to accept a risk, the lower that risk should be. So you could argue it that way, and I suspect they are. I want to tell you one quick story. I was at a conference back in about 2017 or 18. I lose track of time. And I was talking to someone in the rugby space who's a very vocal proponent of rugby safety and welfare. And they've argued, this group have argued that tackling should be banned entirely from kids rugby, among other things. No tackling to happen. And I was talking to him about it, and I said, you can't eliminate risk. You guys are coming at this from a zero risk model where you want there to be no risk. And he said, yeah, absolutely. I said, there's no such thing as no risk. Like kids playing in playgrounds on jungle gyms have a risk of falling and hurting themselves. He said, yeah, but that's why they probably shouldn't do that either. And to me, it's a tragic way to live.
Yeah,
like it's really frustrating. And the reason I tell you that sort of quick anecdote is that there are people in this debate who find themselves kind of caught in the middle of these two opposing sides. And what I can say for sure from my perspective is I've written papers trying to rebut the ban the tackle argument in kids. And part of the reason we do that is we say that rugby gives so many benefits, the physical activity, and Jonathan's alluded to those, but also the contact is a benefit. People want that. So yeah. I would never want to stand up and say, like, I'm defending rugby without contact. It's not rugby anymore. There's other ways I can get my physical fitness without contact. And for a lot of people, the physical contact is the binding thing. It's the thing that attracts them to the sport in the first place. And I'm fully aware of that and will defend that. Now, I don't know, and it's a good point that was made, is I don't know where this ends. I would hope that it ends at a point that's satisfactory to all parties. But there is a philosophical question about how low does the risk need to go. I can say with 100% certain, it's not risk elimination. No one's arguing for zero risk. They're asking for lower risk. The question is how much lower, 20%, 30%, etc. I don't know. But to use the driving analogy, since it came up, is when I get in the car, I understand that there's a risk to me of driving. A car accident could kill me. But I understand that the airbags, my driver's license that I had to obtain, the roadworthiness of the car, the speed limits and other rules of the road are to some degree protective. Now, you could ask, why does society allow me to drive 60 k's an hour when it could make it 40? Probably be safer. But at some point, someone's calibrated, the word again, that response. And I think that's what rugby needs to arrive at is at what point should we stop? Now, again, it's philosophical. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't believe that it continues indefinitely, because at some point it'll reach a, and in fact, as crazy as the last 2 weeks have been, it's been instructive, because I think it's shown us that wherever that line is, it was crossed, and now we have to retreat backwards to see if the sport can find it again, and hopefully that goes some way. And then once that's settled, then I suppose society could change and so forth. But point is, I'm not a fan either of the public health lobby that wants to remove all the risk in our lives. I mean, I think players want the risk that is created by contact, and if you take it away, they respond the way they did in the last couple of weeks.
Can I just come back to Ross on that, because he's absolutely right on basically everything he said there, and I think one of the biggest difficulties for me as an amateur rugby player is rugby sits in this very special place, because for most people, their day-to-day existence is relatively mundane and relatively boring. And the thing you do on the weekend is so unique. That is what drives participation. Now, rugby could decide, if it wanted to become touch rugby, but then it's going to be competing with netball and football and all sorts of other things. Rugby will not survive in that space, let me guarantee you, because frankly, it's just not as good a game as the other ones which I've mentioned. The main driver is the risk. The main driver is the contact. So, that's where I stand on that. Anyone telling me that they're future-proofing the game, they're just not willing to sell the game for the benefits that it already provides.
I mean, it's actually really nice to hear this and state it as passionately as it is, because the activists, and I agree, one shouldn't pander to them, but their opinion is also important because they represent a section of the population. And you say, okay, do these people have a point, or is an element of what they're saying true? So there's them. You're representing a view which I think is a really valuable one, and which maybe hasn't been put forward to those decision makers in a way that's allowing them to factor it in equally with the activists. So it's a classic example, I think, of like they're hearing a voice that is very loud that might not represent the reality. And so they react to that by changing the reality in response to what is actually a minority or smaller perception, right? You see this happen quite a lot, I think. And I wonder whether some of that's in play here, which means that the solution here is for those administrators to be plugged in a little bit better to the needs and wants of their current and future playing populations, and for that current group to match the lobby from the other side that is creating to them this distorted, if that's what is in fact the case. I don't know this for sure. I'm by no means a politician, but it seems to me that maybe, because I know that they're nervous about that, and I can't imagine that they're imagining it into reality. So they are legitimately receiving pressures from outside, and some of those have to be heard, right? Because you can't just ignore it and say, leave us alone, we'll do what we want. It would be irresponsible. But if they're calibrating it incorrectly in response to those pressures, it's because those pressures haven't come equally from both sides.
Would it be all right if I just fired some questions over to Ross? I mean, these are more just general interest questions.
I'll try and answer them. I don't know if I'll have answers, but go for it.
Okay, so we're looking for this middle ground, right? And in my mind, I wonder if I've got the debate slightly wrong or I've got the context wrong. So in my mind, the extreme end is zero risk. I think we agree on that. But the other extreme end isn't the sport that I play. The extreme end is the sport that Courtney Laws plays or Evan Etzebeth plays. That to me is the extreme end. So if we were to look at amateur rugby and where we are, there are so many factors that go into making the pro game so much more dangerous. The size, the aggression, the training, the fitness, the amount of interventions per game. I mean, if we were to make the pro game safe, we would presumably want to limit all of those things. So what I don't really get is when you keep saying the middle, it doesn't sound like the middle to me. It sounds like the middle between no risk in the amateur game, and there's sort of a middle there. Whereas I see the amateur game being in the middle between no risk. In fact, I see it closer to no risk than I do at the top end of the pro game.
Yeah, I mean, look, at an individual level, the amateur risk is considerably lower than the pro game. But to come back to the point from earlier, like the collective is way higher. So if you had 15 professional matches on a weekend in England, you would generate, if it was an average week, 12 concussions. That same weekend in community rugby, even though the individual risk is maybe a quarter of the pros, there's 100 times more matches. So you could, in theory, generate in the hundreds of concussions from amateur rugby. And that's the problem that the authorities are dealing with. It's not individual risk. They have to manage the collective. And so they're looking at that and saying, and your union was called up in front of Parliament to account for this last year or the year before. I've lost track. Not just in the professional game, but in the amateur game, to say, what are you doing to reduce the risk of concussions in kids and community players? And so they are under pressure. That's a reality for them. And that pressure is created by volume, not necessarily risk.
Ross, just on that, how do World Rugby analyze the trial lowering of the tackling height in France in the amateur game against the one that they did in the championship, which we can deem away from the amateur game somewhat?
Yeah, so the championship trial was done in 2019, I think it was, and it was the first attempt to lower the tackle height in law, and it was in a sense doomed from the start because they couldn't get it over the line to be done in the entire RFU championship. So it wasn't a full season. The compromise that was eventually reached was that they were going to do it for 8 weeks during that cup competition that happens mid-season. So effectively, all those players played for a number of weeks or a couple of months under one height. Then for an 8-week block, they played with a lower tackle height. And then after those 8 weeks, went back to the championship and played again. Now, 8 weeks is never going to be enough. So that's the first problem, is there just wasn't a lead in time. There wasn't a campaign to change the behavior and the technical skills. And then it only happened over 8 weeks. And the second problem is that, and this was a communication failure, I think on many parts, was it created the perception that tacklers always had to go low. Now, that's not what you want. You don't, because what we found with the evidence is that the highest risk happens from a head-on-head collision or a head-to-shoulder. So when you have two upright tacklers, that's the most dangerous situation. You see it often. Jamie George a couple of weeks ago was that. The London Irish player who got sent off and concussed, Marnie Libok, was an example. There's a bunch happen every weekend. So you want to get heads out of shared airspace, basically. That was the principle from the very beginning, is get heads away from heads and shoulders. You don't want them to go so low that they're at the knee, but instead you've got like call it a Goldilocks zone, just right, somewhere in the middle. So red zone too high, green zone middle, amber zone too low. That was the simple summary of what we'd found. The problem in the championship trial is it created a perception that you always had to go low. And so instead of seeing head-on-head from upright players, we started seeing head-on-head from bent players, because the ball carrier was going low to the ground and the tackler was trying to get underneath him. And so we ended up moving head impacts from high to low, but still keeping head impacts, right? So no reduction in risk and potentially even more dangerous situations. So that was a pretty poor, and it was a pretty good example of how not to go about this. The French trial was a little different. They announced in 2018 that the following season would use waist high and lower tackles, and it would be at every level except the top 5. I think it was from 6 down, if memory serves me, either 6 down or 7 down. And they also put in parallel, perhaps having learned from the English trial, a law change around the ball carrier that said that the ball carrier, and I quote, is not allowed to project their upper body and head forward into contact. And so that was put there to try and offset and reduce the risk of that, two players charging into one another head first in a low bent over position. I hope that they publish their initial analysis of that. I know it's ongoing. They've partnered with universities to do this, and I hope it gets published, if not scientifically, in a report so that it can be publicly available. But they shared that data with us towards the end of last year and at our medical and scientific meeting in November. And they're reporting that head-to-head impacts are down 63%, which I think is fairly obvious if you lower the height. What will happen is you'll get more head-on-hip and head-on-knee contacts, but all the evidence we have suggests that those are lower in risk than head-on-head. So you should see fewer concussions. And they've seen a 27% drop in their blue card concussions, which are basically where the referee identifies a concussed player. So in that respect, it's an encouraging trial. I'm sure that it's had a few teething problems and issues, lots of penalties initially, for instance. But they did it at a lower level, to answer your question, than the championship. They did it for longer. It's going to go into its 3rd season. And they also paired up lower height with changes around the ball carrier and double tackles. And so I think that's the reason theirs worked and the other one didn't.
Yeah, the French study is interesting. To me, it's far more pertinent than the championship study. I think Ross is absolutely right to point that out. The worrying thing for me is the head-on-head contact did reduce, but overall head contacts were not that much lower. I mean, they were lower, but they weren't that much lower.
But that's exactly what you'd expect. Sorry to interrupt you. That's because you can't tackler's, you can't take the tackler's head out the game. The tackler's head is always going to be at risk. So what you're trying to do on the tackler is reduce the risk by putting the head in a safer place. So it's not massively surprising that head impacts stay the same overall, but you're trying to protect the ball carrier's head and put the tackler in a slightly safer spot. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify.
No, that's a very fair clarification. The overall concussions, if I'm right, for a 14 team, was it 12 team or 14 team league? I don't recall. It was down from 19.7 to 16.2. Now, across each team, that is less than half a concussion per team. And I just wonder who is setting the risk parameters that say 19.7 is unacceptable, 16.2 is acceptable? I don't think anyone's saying that, which leads me to think, okay, so if we're going to change fundamentally the tackle laws, and we're going to change how the ball carrier carries, and we've not even touched on that. I mean, that to me is even more egregious than the tackling. There must be more stuff coming down the road, right? I mean, it can't stop here. 16.2, if 19.7 is unacceptable, 16.2 is pretty much unacceptable too, because eventually somebody will get hurt, and these same people will be sat in front of yet another parliamentary committee, and they'll be facing the same questions, which is, what were you doing? How are you going to reduce this? And until the RFU or anyone actually in a position of authority in rugby stands up to these people and says, no, we're going to do either nothing, or we're going to increase our welfare around the game, but we're not going to change the game because the risk is acceptable. We're just going to have this continual march towards risk reduction, and it's not something that I want.
In 30 seconds, why should the tackle height be lowered? And perhaps, Jonathan, why you don't think it should be lowered?
So I think the tackle height needs to be lowered because at the moment the concussion risk in both levels, all levels of the sport, is, I think, unacceptably high. I understand that different people will differ with respect to where they set an acceptable limit, but for me, any reduction that we can achieve is good. Where I think we need to be cautious is how much we change the sport in order to lower that risk. And the conversation we've had has been very enlightening in that respect. And I hope in future that more administrators and people in charge of the sport will hear the perceptions, because they haven't heard the same volume and weight of argument from the other side as they're currently hearing from the safety lobby, if I can call it that. So there's a need to lower it. There's an even more important need to calibrate how much it gets lowered. And that's where I would rather focus efforts on in the next, say, 2 years.
Yeah. Thank you, Ross, for giving us all of the information. Very much appreciated. Nothing has really moved me to tell me that the risk in the community game is too high. I think we should be coming at this the other way. And this is a message directly to the RFU, which is, if you believe in rugby and the values of rugby, get out there and fight for it. Don't be listening to outside bodies who are putting pressure on you to fundamentally change it. Make the argument, make the argument and win the argument. I would just like to point out that I don't think there is a solution to this. There's only trade-offs, and from what I can see, the trade-offs to the sport, to the friends I've made inside the sport, the clubs, the community, it's just too great. So, despite all of the information, there is not enough here to move my position, unfortunately.
I suppose, and just to finish that, I suppose the only thing that seems like there's an agreement is a difference between the amateur and professional game, and that needs to always be taken into account, that they should be administered separately. But a huge thank you to both of you for your time, Jonathan for giving the amateurs games point of view, and I think that's been very enlightening, and of course Dr. Ross Tucker for the medical standpoint as well. And yeah, and hopefully we can find some sort of happy medium somewhere along the line. But thank you both for your time, guys, and yeah, we will see you. We'll see you perhaps soon again to try and see where the conversation has moved on, whether the dial has been moved, whether the amateur game has had to fight its corner slightly more and been given more of a voice than it has lately.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Ross.
Cheers, guys.